Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a colder time. A time before central heating, before electric blankets, before anyone could casually complain that the room was a bit chilly while standing inside a perfectly insulated box of modern comfort. So dim the lights, settle into whatever position your spine will tolerate, and let's gently wander into the past, where winter was not a season so much as a long-term personal problem. For most of history, staying warm was not about comfort, it was about survival. And for the wealthy, oddly enough, it was about status, because nothing says power quite like shivering expensively in a drafty palace while surrounded by gold. Most people in the past lived in structures that we would generously describe as enthusiastic about airflow. Medieval houses, for example, were often made of stone or timber, which sounds sturdy, until you realize that stone absorbs cold like it's collecting it as a hobby. The walls were thick, yes, but they were also damp, and winter air found its way inside through every possible crack, gap, and philosophical opening. Windows, when they existed, were small, very small. Glass was rare and expensive, so many windows were covered with cloth, parchment, or nothing at all, which meant that whatever warmth you managed to generate indoors had a strong desire to leave immediately. Doors rarely fit properly. Floors were often bare earth or stone. Rugs existed, but mostly in the dreams of peasants and the bedchambers of the rich. The center of warmth in most homes was the hearth. One fire, one opportunity for heat. Everyone gathered around it like planets orbiting a small, smoky sun. The closer you sat, the warmer you were. This created a clear social order based entirely on proximity to flames. Important people got the warm spots, less important people got the cold edges. And animals, cows, goats, sometimes chickens, were often brought inside, partly for protection and partly because a cow produces heat whether you asked it to or not. Smoke was everywhere. Chimneys were a later invention, and even when they existed, they were inefficient. Smoke-filled rooms, coated walls, irritated lungs, and turned everyone slightly gray. Warmth came with consequences, and everyone accepted this because the alternative was frostbite. Clothing, then, became the primary defense against winter. People layered constantly. Linen close to the skin, wool on top, and more wool on top of that. Wool was the miracle fabric of the medieval world. It stayed warm even when damp, which was fortunate because everything was damp. It was heavy, itchy, and nearly impossible to clean properly, but it worked. Fur was even better, if you could afford it or had recently killed something large. Now, peasants endured winter quietly. Royals, on the other hand, endured winter dramatically, while insisting they were far more comfortable than everyone else. Castles, despite their impressive appearance, were famously cold. They were designed to keep enemies out, not warmth in. High ceilings allowed heat to rise and vanish. Stone walls radiated cold like they were proud of it, and long corridors acted as wind tunnels, ensuring that no one was ever accidentally cozy. Kings and queens compensated with fires. So many fires. Every room that mattered had a hearth, and servants spent much of their lives hauling wood, tending flames, and attempting to keep royal extremities from freezing. Even so, it was common for noble families to essentially migrate within their own castles, abandoning colder rooms in winter and clustering together in a few semi-manageable spaces. Beds were another important source of warmth, not because the rooms were warm, far from it, but because people slept together. Families, servants, guests, children, all bundled into the same beds or rooms. Privacy was sacrificed in favor of not dying of cold. Beds were piled with blankets, furs, and sometimes curtains, creating a sort of fabric cave designed to trap body heat. This arrangement was practical, though not particularly dignified. Hot water bottles did not exist, but heated stones did. People would warm stones in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and place them near their feet in bed. This was comforting unless the stone was too hot, in which case it became an exciting nighttime hazard. History is filled with quiet discomfort and occasional mild burns. Food played a role as well. Heavy, warm meals helped people feel less cold. Stews, breads, porridges, dense foods designed to sit heavily in the stomach and generate warmth. Spices were believed to heat the body, so wealthy households consumed them enthusiastically, partly for comfort and partly to demonstrate that they could afford to import flavor from very far away. Now let's drift gently into the world of royal winter misery. Take, for example, medieval kings who ruled over snowy regions. These men wore crowns made of metal that became cold, painfully cold in winter. And yet they persisted because removing the crown would imply weakness, and weakness was apparently worse than mild hypothermia. Many monarchs suffered from chronic illness worsened by cold, damp conditions. Joint pain, respiratory issues, mysterious fevers, all exacerbated by living in stone buildings with limited heating. And yet these same royals would commission vast halls and enormous bedrooms, making their living spaces even harder to warm. Naturally, they made it worse. Queen Elizabeth I famously despised cold drafts and demanded that servants follow her around closing doors and hanging tapestries. Tapestries, by the way, were not just decorative, they were insulation. Thick fabric hung on cold walls to keep warmth from escaping. They also depicted elaborate scenes of hunting, mythology, and political symbolism, all while quietly preventing the queen from freezing. In France, the court of Versailles is often imagined as luxurious and warm. In reality, it was notoriously cold. The palace was massive, drafty, and difficult to heat. Fireplaces existed, but they were inefficient. Nobles wore layers upon layers of silk, velvet, and fur, not just for fashion, but because their bones were cold. Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled from a palace that could not reliably keep him warm. There is something quietly poetic about that. Even bathing was affected by winter. Bathrooms were heated as much as possible, but water cooled quickly. Baths became rare in winter months, partly due to cold and partly due to a widespread belief that opening pores allowed illness to enter the body. Staying warm meant staying dirty, which was considered a reasonable trade-off. Children, especially royal children, suffered quietly. They were dressed in miniature adult clothing, layered heavily, and expected to endure cold rooms without complaint. Many royal children were sickly, fragile, and perpetually uncomfortable. Dynastic inbreeding did not help. Weak constitutions met harsh winters, and the results were predictable. Now let's drift gently northward to Scandinavia, where people had a slightly more practical relationship with winter. Homes were smaller, better insulated, and designed around warmth. Fires were central. Saunas existed in various forms, providing not just warmth, but a sense of ritual comfort. Even so, winters were long, dark, and relentless. People adapted rather than pretending they were above it. Contrast this to southern Europe, where winter was milder but buildings were not designed to retain heat. Stone homes built to stay cool in summer became uncomfortably cold in winter. People simply added layers and fires and hoped for the best. Throughout history, winter exposed social inequality very clearly. The poor froze. The rich complained while freezing slightly less. Everyone waited for spring. And yet there is something oddly calming about this shared human experience. Across centuries, cultures, and classes, people huddled near fires, wrapped themselves in fabric, and tried to sleep while cold air pressed against the walls. Kings and peasants alike lay awake at night, listening to the wind, wondering if the fire would last until morning.
So, as you lie there now, comfortably warm, perhaps with the luxury of choosing your temperature, it's worth appreciating that warmth was once a daily achievement. a careful balance of fire, fabric, food, and endurance. In the next part, we'll drift further into winter lives, into specific royal households, strange personal habits, and the quietly miserable cold weather routines of Europe's most powerful families. For now, stay still, stay warm, and let history continue to hum softly in the background. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. If you're not quite sure anymore, that's even better. Let's continue drifting through the cold, into rooms that were technically indoors, but emotionally still outside. Now that we've settled into the general misery of winter living, let's lean a little closer to the people who had the resources to do something about it, and somehow still managed to be uncomfortable. Royals, nobles, and assorted elites spent centuries proving that money cannot, in fact, buy warmth, or at least not efficiently. One of the great ironies of history is that the most powerful people in society often lived in the worst buildings for winter. Castles were enormous, stone-heavy, and designed for defense, not comfort. Stone walls kept out armies, but they also held on to cold like it was precious. Fireplaces existed, but they were more symbolic than effective. Heat rose straight up and escaped through chimneys, leaving ankles and feet in a state of permanent resentment. This led to the delightful custom of portable warmth. Braziers, small metal containers filled with hot coals, were carried from room to room. Sometimes they were placed beneath tables, sometimes near chairs, occasionally too close to expensive clothing, which led to fires, burns, and frantic servants attempting to smother velvet sleeves. Naturally, this was considered acceptable risk. In Spain and parts of France, nobles used foot warmers, wooden boxes filled with hot embers placed beneath skirts or desks. These were especially popular with women, whose layered dresses acted like fabric insulation systems. The warmth was lovely. The danger of setting oneself on fire was also present, but again, history shows a strong tolerance for mild catastrophe. Beds, meanwhile, became winter survival machines. Nobles slept under mountains of blankets, quilts, furs, and coverlets. Some beds had wooden canopies with curtains on all sides, creating a small enclosed pocket of air that could actually retain heat. These were not decorative choices, they were defensive structures. And then there were bed companions, not romantic ones necessarily. Servants, children, distant relatives, and anyone else who generated heat might be invited or instructed to share a bed. Royal sleeping arrangements were often crowded, awkward, and deeply unprivate, but warmth trumped dignity, always. Let's drift briefly into England, where winter dampness added a special layer of discomfort. Cold, wet air seeped into everything. Fires struggled to dry rooms completely. Clothing stayed heavy and moist. Chronic coughs were everywhere. English monarchs spent winters wrapped in layers, complaining endlessly, and commissioning new tapestries to hang over drafty walls. Henry VIII, for instance, loved warmth. He hated drafts. He demanded roaring fires and heavy clothes, and still spent much of his later life deeply uncomfortable. His increasing weight did provide some insulation, but it also limited his mobility, meaning he spent long periods sitting near fires, sweating on one side and freezing on the other. A truly balanced experience. Elizabeth I, as mentioned earlier, took a more organized approach. She moved frequently between palaces, seeking whichever building was least awful at the time. Servants rushed ahead of her arrival to light fires, hang tapestries, and warm rooms as much as possible. Even so, she was constantly cold, often ill, and deeply irritated by winter, which, given her circumstances, feels reasonable. Now let's wander into the strange medical theories surrounding warmth. For centuries, people believed that the body needed to maintain a careful balance of humors. Cold air was thought to disturb this balance. Opening windows in winter was considered dangerous. Fresh air was suspicious. Ventilation was viewed as an invitation for illness to enter the body and settle in permanently. This belief led to tightly sealed rooms, thick curtains, and very little airflow, which did help retain warmth. It also trapped smoke, dampness, and the collective breath of everyone inside. The air quality was not ideal, but at least it was warm. Royal doctors prescribed warmth as treatment for nearly everything. Cold, more blankets. Fever, more blankets. Sadness, possibly more blankets. Heat was comforting, familiar, and controllable, unlike disease, politics, or succession crises. Children, especially royal children, were wrapped aggressively. Multiple layers, heavy gowns, caps, and stockings. Unfortunately, this did not prevent illness. In fact, the lack of fresh air likely made things worse. Fragile bloodlines met tightly sealed rooms, and many children did not thrive. Dynastic continuity suffered quietly under piles of wool. Now let's drift eastward into colder regions of Europe, where people adapted more practically. In Russia, homes were built with smaller windows, thicker insulation, and large masonry stoves. These stoves, once heated, radiated warmth for hours. Families slept on or near them. This was efficient. It worked. Naturally, Western Europe largely ignored it. Instead, Western elites preferred grandeur. High ceilings, huge rooms, vast halls. All impressive, all impossible to heat. Kings ruled over empires while shivering dramatically. In France, nobles wore absurdly layered clothing indoors. Gloves were worn inside. Cloaks remained on during meals. Wigs added insulation, though that was not their primary purpose. Shoes were lined with fur, and still complaints persisted. Let's pause gently on the idea of indoor winter fashion. Clothing was not just about warmth, it was about signaling wealth. Fur trims, heavy fabrics, and deep colors all said, "I can afford to be warm," even when that warmth was mostly theoretical. Now consider travel in winter. Royals did not stop moving just because it was cold. They traveled with entire households, carts of supplies, portable bedding, tapestries, and heating equipment. Inns were cold, drafty, and inconsistent. Fires were unreliable. Nights were long. Complaints were constant. Letters from nobles are full of winter misery. Cold fingers, stiff joints, endless chills. Everyone believed their suffering was unique. It was not. Now, let's gently touch on one of the most tragic winter facts. Even the best efforts failed often. People froze indoors. Elderly nobles died quietly in winter months. Fires went out. Illness followed cold. Warmth was never guaranteed. And yet, life continued. Meals were eaten. Courts convened. Children were educated. Politics happened slowly, wrapped in blankets. As we drift onward, notice how winter shaped behavior. People stayed inside more. Social life contracted. Even royal courts became quieter. Fires crackled. People sat close together. Conversations slowed. The season encouraged stillness, whether anyone liked it or not. There is something deeply human about this. Across centuries, people endured winter by clustering together, sharing heat, and complaining softly. Kings, queens, servants, farmers, all equally at the mercy of weather. So, as you rest there now, comfortably insulated by modern convenience, remember that warmth was once fragile, temporary, hard-earned, a flickering thing, like the fires that once defined winter survival. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into specific royal habits, strange routines, personal obsessions with heat, and the quietly absurd lengths elites went to just to feel slightly less cold. For now, let the cold fade away and stay exactly where you are.
If you're only vaguely aware that someone is talking about cold castles and bad decisions, then you're exactly where you should be. Let's keep drifting. By now, it should be clear that winter did not inspire efficiency in historical elites. What it inspired instead was ritual, habits, routines, small, deeply held beliefs about warmth that were rarely questioned and almost never effective. One of the most common royal winter strategies was simply not moving. Movement required leaving the fire. Leaving the fire meant cold. Therefore, the solution was to arrange life so that everything important happened near flames. Councils met in heated chambers. Meals were served close to hearths. Important conversations occurred in rooms that were marginally less hostile to human life. Kings held court wrapped in layers, sometimes wearing cloaks indoors, sometimes seated beside massive fireplaces that consumed entire trees daily. Firewood was a political resource. Forests were managed not just for ships and buildings, but for warmth. A royal household burned through astonishing amounts of wood in winter, and servants spent much of their lives feeding fires like solemn, underpaid priests. And yet, despite all this effort, warmth remained localized. One side of the body would roast while the other froze. People complained of hot faces and cold feet. This imbalance became so common that it was accepted as normal. Medical texts even commented on it, calmly noting that uneven warmth was simply part of life. Now let's talk about personal heating obsessions, because history is full of them. Some monarchs became deeply preoccupied with temperature. They demanded rooms be warmed to very specific levels, often based on personal superstition rather than comfort. If a king believed cold air caused illness, and many did, then windows stayed closed permanently. Fresh air was treated as an enemy agent. Louis XIV famously hated cold air. Windows at Versailles were kept shut even when rooms filled with smoke and sweat. The result was warm, stagnant air layered with perfume, body odor, and ambition. Courtiers fainted regularly, though this was blamed on weak constitutions rather than obvious environmental issues. In contrast, other rulers believed too much heat was dangerous. They tolerated cold rooms out of fear that warmth weakened the body. This belief was particularly common among those who prided themselves on discipline. Suffering, after all, was character building. Freezing was practically a virtue. Nowhere was this more apparent than in royal children. Royal nurseries were often cold by modern standards. Children were believed to benefit from hardening. This meant exposure to cold air, minimal fires, and strict routines. Naturally, many children became sick. This was interpreted not as a flaw in the system, but as evidence that the child was weak to begin with. Dynasties quietly lost heirs to winter illnesses and blamed fate. Let's linger gently on royal childhoods for a moment. Imagine being born into unimaginable privilege, only to spend your early years bundled in stiff clothing, sleeping in drafty rooms, and being told that warmth would make you soft. Many future kings grew up perpetually cold, mildly miserable, and emotionally distant, which explains quite a lot, actually. Now let's drift toward another winter strategy: textiles everywhere. Tapestries were not just art, they were insulation disguised as storytelling. Thick, woven scenes of battles, hunts, and religious imagery covered walls to trap warmth. In some castles, every available surface was draped in fabric during winter. Curtains hung in doorways, cloth lined windows, even furniture was covered. Royal households owned seasonal sets of furnishings. Summer versions were lighter, winter versions were heavier, darker, thicker.
Entire rooms transformed with the seasons, not for fashion, but for survival. And still, people complained. Now consider something quietly fascinating: royal sleep schedules in winter. Without artificial lighting, nights were long. People slept more. Royals often retired early, rose late, and spent hours in bed simply because it was warmer there. Bedchambers became winter refuges. Some monarchs conducted business from bed. Letters were dictated under piles of blankets. Audiences were held seated beside beds. Servants hovered quietly, managing fires and curtains. Power was exercised horizontally because standing was cold. Let's drift briefly into one particularly odd solution: warming drinks. Alcohol played a role. Wine, mulled with spices, was believed to warm the body. Beer, ale, and mead were consumed constantly. Hot drinks provided temporary comfort and a sense of control over the cold. Of course, alcohol also lowered body temperature slightly, but no one noticed, or if they did, they ignored it. Spices were also believed to generate internal heat. Cinnamon, cloves, pepper, these were luxury items, imported at great expense and consumed enthusiastically in winter. Spiced wine became a status symbol. If you could afford to heat yourself from the inside with imported flavor, you were doing well. Now let's gently step outside again, just for a moment. Outdoor winter clothing for elites was impressive and impractical. Long cloaks lined with fur, heavy boots, gloves, hats, layers upon layers. Mobility suffered. Nobles moved slowly, carefully, and rarely. Slipping on ice was dangerous and embarrassing. Winter discouraged unnecessary movement, which suited many rulers just fine. Travel slowed. Armies paused when possible. Campaigns avoided winter unless desperation demanded otherwise. Armies froze. Horses suffered. Kings learned slowly that winter was not a cooperative partner. And yet, some rulers insisted on winter travel. Charles XI of Sweden, for instance, famously campaigned in brutal cold, convinced that discipline and determination could overcome weather. They could not. Winter won, as it usually does. Let's drift back indoors to a quieter, more personal discomfort: toes. Cold feet were a universal complaint. Floors were freezing. Shoes offered limited insulation. Socks were woolen but thin. Foot warmers became essential. People tucked feet in cloaks, near fires, under skirts, beneath furniture. Cold toes haunted history. Some nobles slept with their feet wrapped separately. Others kept servants tasked specifically to warm bed linens before sleep. This involved heating irons or stones and placing them in beds. Fires were constant. Accidents happened. Sheets burned. People screamed quietly. Now consider the servants. While nobles complained about cold, servants endured it actively. They rose early, tended fires, hauled water, moved through unheated corridors. They slept in cold rooms.
So as you lie there now, listening to this quiet catalog of historical discomfort, notice how far away it all feels. The cold of the past is distant, muted, softened by time and narration. The fires have gone out. The castles are silent. In the next part, we'll drift into even more peculiar winter behaviors, superstitions, rituals, and the subtle ways cold shaped royal personalities and decisions. For now, stay still, stay warm, and let the past continue to fade gently into sleep. By now, the cold has become familiar. Not sharp or shocking, just present, like a quiet inconvenience that refuses to leave, which is exactly how winter behaved for most of history. So let's continue, gently,
into the softer, stranger ways people tried to make peace with it. One of the more subtle winter strategies was routine. People learned, slowly, that fighting the cold directly was exhausting. Instead, they adjusted their lives around it. Days shortened, activities slowed, expectations lowered. Even royal courts, usually buzzing with intrigue and performance, softened in winter. Fewer events, less movement, more sitting. Kings became noticeably more sedentary in cold months. Not officially, of course. No one wrote, "His Majesty is lying down because the floor is unbearable." Instead, they framed it as contemplation, reflection, strategic thinking, all of which happened to be much easier while wrapped in furs near a fire. Royal councils in winter were quieter affairs. Less travel meant fewer visitors. Diplomacy slowed. Letters took longer. Decisions stretched out. Winter, in this way, shaped politics simply by making everyone slightly too cold to rush. Now let's drift into superstition, because winter encouraged it. Cold was often associated with illness, bad luck, and moral imbalance. A draft was not just unpleasant, it was suspicious. A sudden chill meant something was wrong. People believed cold air could sneak into the body and settle there, causing pain, weakness, or worse. Which is why windows remained shut with near religious devotion. Some monarchs developed elaborate rules about airflow. Certain doors were never opened in winter. Certain corridors were avoided. Entire wings of palaces were declared unsafe until spring. Servants learned these rules quickly. Forgetting to close a door could earn a reprimand, or worse. Amulets and charms also appeared, objects believed to ward off illness caused by cold. Religious relics were kept close. Prayers were said before sleep, not just for the soul, but for warmth. God, it was assumed, controlled the weather. Appeasing him seemed reasonable. Let's linger quietly on religious spaces, because churches and monasteries were among the coldest places imaginable. Stone buildings, high ceilings, minimal fires. Monks and nuns endured winter in silence, wrapped in habits that were warm-ish at best. They prayed in cold chapels, hands stiff, breath visible. Cold was framed as purification. Discomfort brought one closer to God, which was a comforting thought, especially if you were already uncomfortable. Monasteries did, though, develop clever heating tricks. Large kitchens provided warmth that radiated into nearby rooms. Dormitories were often built above heated spaces. Fires were carefully managed to conserve fuel. Even so, winters were harsh. Now imagine being a royal visiting such a place. Accustomed to fires, furs, and servants adjusting your environment constantly, suddenly thrust into holy cold. Many rulers found this deeply unpleasant. Some found it humbling. Most found it unnecessary. Let's drift now into winter health, or what passed for it. Doctors believed that cold thickened the blood and slowed bodily processes. This was not entirely wrong, but their solutions were creative. Warming poultices, heated oils, bloodletting, which did not help warmth but was applied anyway because it was applied to everything. Warm baths were sometimes recommended, though bathing in winter was rare and risky. Heating water took time. Bathing spaces were cold. Stepping out of a warm bath into freezing air was considered dangerous, so most people simply avoided the issue altogether. Instead, they focused on maintaining internal heat, heavy meals, spiced foods, alcohol, sleep. Lots of sleep. Winter encouraged long nights in bed, not because people were lazy, but because bed was the warmest place available. Royal bedchambers became winter sanctuaries.
Fires burned constantly, curtains stayed closed, light was dim, activity was minimal. Kings and queens spent hours reclining, listening to music, or simply resting. This was framed as leisure, but it was also survival. Now let's gently examine royal fashion again, because winter truly tested it. Clothing grew heavier, silhouettes expanded, layers multiplied. The goal was not elegance, it was insulation disguised as elegance. Sleeves became enormous, collars grew thick, cloaks turned into wearable blankets. Yet fashion often worked against warmth. Tight shoes restricted circulation. Heavy wigs trapped heat unevenly. Jewelry chilled the skin. Metal buttons were cold to the touch. And yet, appearance mattered. Looking regal took precedence over comfort. Some monarchs famously refused to dress warmly enough, believing that suffering enhanced authority. Others went to the opposite extreme, bundling so thoroughly that movement became difficult. Both approaches were admired, criticized, and imitated. Now let's drift into nighttime, because winter nights were long, dark, and quiet. Without electric light, evenings were subdued. Candles were expensive. Fires provided light, but not much. People went to bed early. They slept in segments, first sleep, a brief waking, then second sleep. This pattern allowed them to tend fires, pray, or simply lie awake listening to wind. Cold crept in at night. Fires died down. Rooms chilled. People pulled blankets tighter, pressed closer together, and waited for morning. Sleep was not always deep, but it was frequent. Royal insomnia was common in winter. Kings worried, queens worried. Cold did not help. Letters mentioned sleepless nights, stiff joints, restless thoughts. Winter amplified everything that was already uncomfortable. Now consider pets, because even royal animals felt winter. Small dogs were kept close for warmth. They slept on beds, under blankets, near fires. Cats appeared in chambers for similar reasons. Larger animals stayed in stables, generating heat that sometimes warmed nearby rooms. Humans and animals coexisted for mutual thermal benefit. This closeness softened winter slightly. There is something comforting about shared warmth, even across species. History is full of quiet companionship born of cold nights. As we drift onward, notice how winter created a slower rhythm, less ambition, more endurance. People did not conquer winter, they endured it, repeatedly, year after year. And in that endurance, something human emerges. Not drama, not triumph, just persistence. So as you lie there now, wrapped in modern warmth, let this gentle parade of historical discomfort fade into the background. Fires crackle softly in distant centuries. Curtains sway. Cold presses politely against stone walls. In the next part, we'll drift toward the final quiet consequences of winter. How it shaped personalities, marriages, tempers, and the subtle irritations that followed people long after the snow melted. For now, stay still, stay warm, and let the past continue to fade gently into sleep.
If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're half asleep, even better. This final part will drift slowly toward quiet conclusions, the kind history rarely announces, but always delivers eventually. By the time winter had settled in for weeks or months, something subtle happened to people. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a gradual narrowing of patience. Cold did not make people heroic, it made them tired. And among elites, especially royals, that tiredness showed itself in small, persistent ways.
Winter shaped personalities. Kings became irritable. Queens became withdrawn. Courts grew tense, not because of great political crises, but because everyone was cold, stiff, and deeply over it. Letters written in winter are shorter, sharper, and more complaint-filled. Decisions slowed, tempers shortened, and marriages, already fragile, grew quietly worse. Royal marriages in winter were not cozy affairs. Separate chambers were common. Shared warmth was practical, but affection was optional. Many couples avoided each other entirely, retreating into their own heated spaces. Cold amplified distance. Silence grew longer. Minor grievances hardened. And when couples did share space, discomfort did not help romance. Imagine negotiating dynastic alliances while your feet are numb, or discussing heirs while wrapped in itchy wool, listening to the fire sputter. Winter was not a season of intimacy, it was a season of endurance. Children felt this tension. Winter confined families indoors, forcing proximity without comfort. Lessons continued, discipline remained strict, play was limited. Many royal children associated winter with stillness, quiet, and restraint. Warmth was controlled, affection was formal. These early experiences shaped rulers who later struggled with empathy, flexibility, or warmth, emotional as much as physical. Now let's consider petty royal winter meltdowns, because they absolutely happened. Kings complained about drafts obsessively. Queens accused servants of negligence when fires burned low. Arguments broke out over seating arrangements near the hearths. Who was warmest mattered, it always mattered. Winter revealed hierarchy not through titles, but through proximity to heat. In some courts, entire rivalries formed around comfort. A favorite courtier seated near the fire was an insult to others. Warmth became political. Being cold became symbolic, and yes, people remembered. Winter also encouraged nostalgia. Royals reminisced about summer residences, warm hunts, and easier days. They planned future projects obsessively, imagining better buildings, improved heating, new palaces that would finally solve the problem. Spoiler, they rarely did. Each generation believed it would outbuild winter, and each generation was wrong. Now let's drift toward the quiet reality that winter eventually ended. Spring came, fires were reduced, curtains opened, windows cautiously cracked. People breathed more freely, and almost immediately they forgot how miserable winter had been.